ग्रन्थस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकाय चक्षुरुन्मिलितमेन तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः. We continue reading the book Teachings.
Hare Krishna Mata, you are on the mute.
Oh, I'm sorry, Prabhu. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanasalakaya Chakshurunmilitamena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. We continue reading Teachings of Lord Chaitanya book, chapter 25 today. Chapter 25, Personal and Impersonal Realizations. The Puranas are called a supplementary Vedic literature because sometimes in the original Vedas, the subject matter is too difficult to be understood by the common man. The Puranas therefore explain things nicely by different stories and historical incidents. So in the Srimad Bhagavatam, it is stated in the 10th canto, 14th chapter, that Maharaj Nanda and the cowherdmen and inhabitants of Vrindavan generally are very fortunate because the Supreme Brahman, the personality of Godhead, full of bliss, is now engaged there in his eternal pastimes as their friend. According to Svetasvatara Upanishad, the mantra of Apanipado, although Brahman has no materially created hands and legs, still he walks very stately and he accepts everything offered to him. These words suggest that he has transcendental limbs of the body and therefore he is not impersonal. The person who does not understand the Vedic principles simply stresses the impersonal material features of the Supreme Absolute Truth and thus unceremoniously calls the Absolute Truth impersonal. According to the Vishnu Purana 6.7.61 to 3, the living entities are considered as Kshatragna energy. Although the living entity is part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, and is fully cognizant, still he becomes entrapped in the material contamination and therefore suffers all the miseries therein. Such living entities live in different positions in proportion to their entanglement in material nature. The purport is that the original energy of the Supreme Lord is spiritual and non different from the Supreme Absolute Personality of Godhead. The living entity is called the marginal energy of the Supreme Lord, whereas the material energy is called inferior. On account of possessing inert and material inebriety, the living entity, although in the marginal position, becomes entangled with the inferior energy matter. At that time, he forgets his spiritual significance and identifies himself with the material energy and therefore becomes subjected to threefold misery. When he is, however, free from that material contamination, he proportionately becomes situated in different standards of life. According to the Vedic instruction, everyone should understand the constitutional of the living entity, the Lord and the material energy in their interrelation. First of all, one should try to understand the constitutional position of the Supreme Lord, the personality of Godhead. That Supreme Personality of Godhead has eternal, cognizant, blissful body. His spiritual energy is distributed as eternity, knowledge, and bliss. In his blissful identity, there is his pleasure potency, and in his eternal identity, he is the cause of everything. And in his cognizant identity, he is the supreme knowledge. Krishna means that supreme knowledge. In other words, the supreme personality of Krishna is the reservoir of all knowledge, all pleasure, and all eternity. That supreme knowledge of Krishna is exhibited in three different energies. They are called internal energy, marginal energy, and external energy. By internal energy, he exists in himself with his spiritual paraphernalia. By material existence, he exhibits himself as the living entities, and by marginal existence, he exhibits himself as the living entities, and by his external energy, He exhibits himself as the material energy. In each and every exhibition of his different energies, there is the background of eternity, pleasure potency, and cognizance potency. The conditioned soul is the marginal potency overpowered by the external potency. When the marginal potency, however, comes under the spiritual potency, the marginal potency becomes eligible for love of Godhead. The Supreme Lord enjoys with six kinds of opulences, and nobody can establish that he is formless or that he is without energy. If somebody says that, it is completely against the Vedic instruction. Actually, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the master of all energies. The living entity, being an infinitesimal part and parcel, becomes overpowered by the material energy. In the Mundaka Upanishad, it is stated that two birds of same feather are sitting on one tree. One of them is eating the fruit of the tree, and the other is not eating the fruit of the tree, but is witnessing the activities of the other bird. When the bird eating the fruit of the tree looks on other bird, he becomes freed from all anxieties. This is the position of the infinitesimal living entity. So long as he is forgetful of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he is subjected to the threefold misery. But when he looks to the Supreme Lord or becomes a devotee of the Supreme Lord, he becomes free from all anxieties and miseries of material existence. This position of the living entity means that he is eternally subordinate to the Supreme Lord. The Supreme Lord is always the master of all energies, whereas the living entities are always under the energies of the Supreme Lord. The living entity, although qualitatively one with the Supreme Lord, has a tendency to lord it over the material nature. But being infinitesimal, the living entity has the tendency to be controlled by material nature. This qualification of the living entity is called marginal potency because the living entity has a tendency for being controlled by the material nature. He cannot at any stage of life become one with the Supreme Lord. If a living entity were equal to the Supreme Lord, then there would be no chance of his being controlled by the material energy. In Bhagavad Gita, the living entity has been described as one of the energies of the Supreme Lord. Energy, although inseparable from the energetic, is still energy and cannot be equal with the energetic. In other words, the living entity is simultaneously one and different from the Supreme Lord. The Bhagavad Gita in the 7th chapter, verses 4 to 5, clearly states the earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego are the 8 different elementary energies of the Supreme Lord. All these energies are of inferior quality, whereas the living entity has energy of superior quality. Therefore, Vedic instruction confirms the transcendental form of the Supreme Lord as eternal, blissful, and full of knowledge. The conception of impersonalism is the opposite of the transformations of the material modes of nature. The form beyond the modes of material nature is not exactly like the form of this material world, but there is form which is called spiritual form. That spiritual form cannot be compared with any one of these material forms. Anyone, therefore, who does not agree to accept the spiritual form of the Supreme Lord is counted among the atheists. Lord Buddha did not accept these Vedic principles, and therefore the Vedic teachers considered him an atheist. Although Mayavadi philosophers do pretend to accept the Vedic principles, they indirectly preach the Buddhist philosophy or atheistic philosophy without acceptance of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This philosophy is inferior to Buddha's philosophy, which directly denies the Vedic authority. But the Mayavadi philosophy is distinguished as Vedanta philosophy and is thus more dangerous than Buddhism or atheism. Stop here. Just summarize what we did today. So, first, in the beginning of the chapter, it's mentioned that a person who does not understand the Vedic principles simply stresses the uh, like the important material features of the supreme absolute truth, and thus unceremoniously calls the absolute truth as impersonal. And it's mentioned the living entity is, even though part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, still he becomes entrapped in the material contamination and therefore suffers all the miseries. The three different energies of the Lord is mentioned here. That is the internal energy, marginal energy, and external energy. Internal energy is the spiritual energy of the Lord, and marginal energy, that is the living entities, comes under marginal energy, and the external energy is the material energy, which is the inferior energy of the Lord. While living entities are marginal because they have a tendency to come in even though they are superior in nature, they have a tendency to come in contact with the inferior material energy, and becomes entangled with the inferior energy, and then forgets his specific significance and identifies himself with material energy. That's why the living entities are subjected to threefold miseries of life, and they are known as the marginal energy. So it is also mentioned that we should understand that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is eternal, blissful, and full of knowledge, Satchidanand. Then he is the cause of everything. He is the master of all these three energies. He is the reservoir of all knowledge, all pleasure, all eternity, and uh, by the internal energy, he exists himself with his spiritual paraphernalia. By marginal existence, he exhibits himself as the living entities, and by his external energy, he exhibits himself as the material energy. The marginal potency, however, comes under the spiritual potency, and the marginal potency becomes eligible for the love of Godhead. Example is given about the two birds sitting on the same tree. One bird is eating the fruit of the tree, and other bird is not eating but witnessing all the activities of the eating bird. So once the eating bird, they are actually the living entities, and the bird who is witnessing is the Paramatma, that is Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. When the eating bird stops eating the fruit, that means stops enjoying the material nature and trying to lord it over the material energy, and turns its face towards Krishna, then it will become fully Krishna conscious, because it has tendency to, though Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita 15.7, Mama Vamsa Jiva Loka Jiva Bhuta Sanatana Mana Sastendriyani Prakriti Sthani Karsati. So living entities are part and parcel of Krishna, but because they're um, struggling here in the in the material world, because they're, even though they're superior energy, they're trying to lord it over the material. When they try to lord it over the material nature, they comes under the control of the material nature, because they cannot do, because Krishna is the real controller, not the living entities. And yes, it's mentioned also in Bhagavad Gita 7.4 and 7.5 also, like how the material energy consists of the five different parts, like earth, water, air, fire, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. Total eight, like five gross and three subtle elements. And the living entity is trying to lord it over all these things. Yeah, so our understanding is, we should understand Krishna is this, he's the real controller. We should not try ourselves. We should understand the position of Krishna and the position of ourselves. We should be always servant of Krishna. We should not try to be the master of everything. Jiver Swarup hai Krishna Nitya Das. That's our real identity, and we should understand that and